Carl Jung had a very interesting quote on loneliness. And he said, loneliness does not come from having no people around you, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to you, or from holding certain views which others find inadmissible. Now, this quote is very profound, like most of Jung's work. And if you are starting off reading psychology, I wouldn't necessarily recommend starting with Jung. A lot of his stuff can be very deep, very hard to get through. It requires a lot of synthesis. It requires a lot of previous knowledge about psychology as well. But this quote in and of itself is quite profound, in which he says that loneliness is not a physical state. Loneliness is a psychological state. And this is a new conceptualization that one can use to understand loneliness and combat loneliness. Because, gentlemen, loneliness is an epidemic in the modern day. Not only is it an epidemic in the modern day, more and more research has been showing that loneliness has the same deleterious impacts on a person's health than smoking cigarettes, same as drinking alcohol, and in many cases worse. Like someone who's lonely, someone who's completely isolated and shut off from the rest of the world, perhaps as a result of a depressive state, perhaps as a result of deciding to self-isolate, that person has more negative health markers than someone who's not lonely, is very social, has a great community around them, but chooses to engage in bad lifestyle factors, like such as eating junk food, smoking cigarettes. Right? Perhaps it depends on the amount of cigarettes and your genetics as well when it comes to your proclivity to get lung cancer from cigarettes. Same thing with drinking alcohol. Genetics plays a big role as well. But that is how profound of a disease loneliness is, if you can even call it a disease. That's how profound of a condition loneliness is. And the first thing you have to do is you have to recognize it as a psychological condition rather than a physical condition if you want to combat this effectively, because we have all felt lonely at various points throughout our lives, right? I've definitely felt lonely at various points throughout my life. And what I've noticed, right, especially if you live in the West, or if you live anywhere, if you have interests, if things that interest you deviate from the norm, you are inevitably going to find yourself lonely at one point or another. And we'll talk about how to combat this momentarily. But it is now June 15th, June 16th, 2026. We just had the World Cup. France just played Senegal. We just had UFC 250. We just had, Donald Trump's birthday where he hosted the UFC at the White House, and there was a White House card. We had, there are a million distractions going on right now, right? Breads and circuses, all right? There's a reason why when Rome was losing a battle in ancient Rome, the emperors would put on shows. They'd put on, insane gladiator games, and the citizens would come and they'd watch, and it was to distract them from what was really going on. When you look at the fact that inflation is eroding people's ability to live, when you look at what happened with the Epstein files and the fact that there's not been a single arrest, when you look at the rape gang inquiry that just came out in the United Kingdom, when you look at a multitude of factors and then you realize that the average person is distracted with bread and circuses, it doesn't give you a very strong perception of society. Now, couple this with the fact that your interests may include things like reading literature. You might want to read classical literature. You might want to read Oscar Wilde, Steinbeck, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy. You want to read great classics like the Odyssey, the Iliad. And when you try and communicate this to people around you, especially if you grew up in a sort of middle class, lower middle class neighborhood like I did, chances are the people that you went to high school with, the people that you grew up with, they're not going to have the same interests. If you want to talk about history, if you want to talk about the military campaigns of Alexander, of Napoleon, if you want to talk about why society is the way that it is, and you want to point to historical factors that led to society being the way that it is, and you want to discuss those and you want to have those conversations with those, with people around you, you are unable to. And as a result, it causes you to be lonely. Now, as I've mentioned previously, loneliness has a lot of negative health impacts. It's not particularly great for your negative health, and we discussed that it is a psychological condition usually caused by having differing interests. Now, what do you do? All right, that is the next question. What do you do? Well, what you do is you try and find a group of people that are like you. And one of the avenues that you can use to leverage, one of the avenues that you can use to find this group of people, one of the avenues that you can leverage to find this group of people is the internet, right? The internet has enabled so much growth, so much connection, and it has enabled so much education. Think about how many kids out there started off, because, in life you have first order consequences. Like if you drink a, glass of alcohol, you're probably going to get drunk, but then you have second and third order consequences. For instance, you might really want to put a television in your bedroom, but the second and third order consequence of putting that television on your bedroom is because you spent $2,000 or $3,000 on that television, you feel obligated to use it. Now you're watching it. Now, as a result, you don't go to the gym as often. Now you're gaining weight. Now, because you're gaining weight, your girlfriend leaves you, and because your girlfriend leaves you, you become depressed. Because you become depressed, you don't perform as good at at work, and perhaps you get fired. That's probably like a seventh or eighth order consequence, but it all stems from a small decision. Look at the internet. The internet has enabled a lot of negative behavior as well, but you look at like how many kids must have come across a video about ancient Roman history, and now they've become, they started reading Suetonius, Pliny the Elder, Livy. They started reading a lot of Roman historians on their own accord. How many kids came across a video of Napoleon, right? I myself was one of them. Like 10 years ago, I was just watching history videos on YouTube, and it sparked my interest to read. And you can use the internet in a variety of mechanisms to find like-minded people. The second thing I would recommend is changing your environment. If you come from a small town and people there are complacent, you don't have to harbor anything against the people themselves, right? We're all children of God. They have their own lives going on, but they're not interested in growth. They're not interested in changing their worldview. They're not interested in learning and synthesizing more information and intaking more information. They're interested in just continuing to live the way that they've always lived. And you can't have deep philosophical conversations with those people. So change your environment, right? If you get into a university in a different city, go to that different city and go to the library in your university, or join a few clubs and try and make friends there. Or, look at like a book club in your local area. Look at like comment section on local. If you live in a city, chances are there are Instagram pages and X pages dedicated to your city, news in your city, culture in your city, and look at the comment section of those pages and DM those people, especially if they comment something that's slightly controversial, but you agree with them. Chances are you'll have a similar worldview, not entirely similar, so you can still challenge each other and grow in that regard, but you can, have a similar worldview, and you'll probably get along if you think similarly. That is the end for this video, but it is quite a profound quote, how loneliness doesn't come from not having people around you. It comes from having views that other people find inadmissible. This is another thing that I'll briefly touch on. As Jung said in his quote, having views that other people find inadmissible. What does this mean? It means that when you begin to read a lot of history, you realize that our time is an anomaly. You realize, and you come up with opinions, right? You come up with certain opinions. You come up with, for instance, look at the state of democracy, right? That's like a non-controversial thing that I can say. If I start talking about populations or people, it's a lot more controversial, but look at the state of democracy. Why does democracy exist? Why is that a good thing? If you live in a democratic country, it's taken for granted that you support democracy, right? One person, one vote democracy. But why is that the best way to govern a country when we know that the masses can be easily manipulated, that the masses can be easily distracted, that another force like the Epstein class can derail democracy by subverting the top elements, and now you have the illusion of having two choices, but chances are both those choices serve the same master, and they're not going to implement any change that's really going to help you and your situation out. And as a result, you have the illusion of democracy, but nothing democratic is actually happening behind the scenes, because democracy just means people's will, right? And then imagine you have that opinion, you start reading about it, you start researching about it, you start joining online forums about it, and then you become very well educated on that particular topic. It could be, the state of democracy, it could be psychology, it could be philosophy, it could be politics, it could be history, it could be, it could be like the state of certain, it could be entrepreneurship, it could be business. You become very well educated on that thing. And what you do is, next time you're in polite society, you say something like, I don't believe in democracy. Well, what you have to realize is you've gone through a multi-month or multi-year journey in order to reach the conclusion that you've reached. The people that are interacting with you, they just see you, right? Like, to them, that's the first thing you've ever said. They don't have the thought process that you have. And as a result, you become alienated, right? This is fundamentally why people get assigned labels like far left, far right, and they're ostracized from society. I think that a lot of these people aren't necessarily bad people, whether they're far left or far right. It's that they've identified problems with society. They've begun to do a lot of research and reading. Perhaps they've fallen into echo chambers, which is a negative impact, but they've done a lot of reading and a lot of research, and they've come to an opinion. And that opinion in and of itself is what society finds inadmissible, but they haven't gone through the thought process they haven't explained or articulated the thought process that led them to that opinion. So the way you combat this is lead people through the thought process. Or if you've gone from here, which is what the societal mainstream is, to here, maybe when you're in polite society, only voice an opinion that's here, right? It's one of the laws from the 40 rules of power, which is think as you do, behave like others. Because chances are, when you begin to grow, when you begin to do things that the average person doesn't do, the average person doesn't read, the average person doesn't self-educate, the average person is not interested in these things, right? They're interested in distractions. When you begin to do these things, you set yourself apart. And when you set yourself apart, you inevitably have ideas that those people don't have. And if you voice those ideas, you'll find yourself lonely, right? Or you'll find yourself isolated. And social isolation, thanks to evolutionary psychology, you have to realize in the old days, if you were isolated, it often meant death, right? Because you couldn't survive without the tribe in hunter-gatherer days. So you have this evolutionary mechanism within you that does not want you to be socially isolated. And that causes a lot of people to fall back into complacency. But personally, I don't think that's a good idea, right? The last thing I'll say is you have the possibility of, attracting envy in those around you. When you take a stand, here's what you have to realize. Everything under the sun has a shadow. When you stand up and when you make a stand, and that doesn't have to literally mean making a stand, it could be metaphorical, right? Making a stand. When you say something, I believe in XYZ, that thing has an antithetical element, a shadow. And that shadow is the opposite of whatever opinion that you have. So the moment you make a stand, the moment you stand up, you inevitably cast a shadow. And when you cast a shadow, that shadow is going to attract envy, right? In the form of other people attacking you. Also, when you stand up and when you begin to make effort and take action, it also threatens people around you because they haven't made the effort or taken the action themselves, and you threaten their view of themselves by exposing their complacency. So as a result, you might find them being envious. There's a saying which is like, be big in Japan, because the last place that might honor what good you have to bring to the world is the place that you grew up in, right? So that might be an element of loneliness too. The moment people have a perception of you, if someone's known you all throughout high school, for instance, or all throughout university, they have 4 or 5 years of reference experience for you. And then let's say you take 2 years to work on yourself and you come back. You've changed a lot. You're a completely new person, but their perception of you is the exact same. And it's going to take an equal requisite amount of time. If someone knew you for 4 years and now you've changed and then you meet them again, it's going to take another 4 years for their perception of you to update. And you have to ask yourself, is that an investment that you're willing to make? In most cases, it's probably no. So it's often good to relocate and change your environment and understand that the people that you grew up with might not necessarily view you in the way that you are right now because they have a past perception of you. So the way you combat that is by introducing yourself to new people, understanding that you have a sophisticated worldview that has, evolved as a result of years of research. But if you voice that worldview, people are going to think of you as crazy. So you might want to voice a worldview that's slightly less extreme, if we can call it that. And that is how you exist in polite society. That's how you combat loneliness. And that is it for today's video.